Hello and welcome to our weekly share on the Parsha. And of course, it's Parshas BeShalach. This is the climax of the exodus of the Jewish people from Mitzrayim. It's the time to go. Carpe diem, as they say in Latin, the moment to grab the day. And the Jewish people leave Egypt. And of course, there's the dramatic postscript, which is the drowning of the Egyptian army, which chases after them to try and bring them back and re-enslave them. So far, so good. We're going to be looking at this because this new series is through the eyes of the Torah of Kelm, although with a slight deviation at the end, which if you're with me, you will soon see. I should add, this is the second time I've recorded this share today. The last time it was not recorded by Zoom, or if you're Hasidic, Zim, and I'm quite miffed. If you ask for help, you have to pay more money. So anyway, so I'm trying again. I hope that 40 minutes or so are not wasted. Again, it was early in the morning. However, for my loyal group of followers for this year, I hope you enjoy it. We dedicate, as usual, the year to people who need a refuah shlema or some other celebration that might be coming along, like a bar mitzvah or a wedding. But this week, it's our usual 4 people who need a refuah shlema. Rafal Chai Ben Sora, who is busy trying to or his doctor's busy trying to get to the glitch and the bump in the road in which he's traveling, and fighting his illness. It should be a successful road which leads the doctors to find exactly what's wrong, sort that out, so that my dear friend Rafal can be back bouncing on his feet very, very soon. 2, Oriachaim ben Chana Yehudis, the little boy waiting for a lung transplant. We, of course, hope that that too has a quick and speedy resolution. To Yechezkel Yehuda ben Yenta, cousin of mine and dear friend, who is recovering from serious surgery in Eretz Yisrael, and to my own dear wife, Ita Rivka Basima Esther, who is getting back on her feet, no pun intended, after her second complete knee replacement. She should also be successful in her physical therapy and her recovery and refuah. That's taken care of that. Let's move on. So, of course, the Jewish people in Parshas BeShalach is standing at the gates to Mitzrayim. They leave exactly at the moment they have to leave. Carpe diem. If they don't leave now, apparently they're going to be finished altogether, a point we're coming back to. And here we're going to be talking basically, the share is based around the teachings of Reb Yerucham, the Mashgiach of Mir, and of course the most famous Talmud of Reb Simcha Zissel, the founder of Kelm. But before we get to this, the topic is time, and how it affects. This is the moment to leave Mitzrayim. And before we get to Reb Yerucham, I think it would be appropriate to look at his perhaps most famous Talmud, and that would be Reb Shlomo Wolbe. Reb Shlomo Wolbe has got some very interesting things to say about time. It's a topic which I've always been extremely intrigued by. I was almost tempted to say for a long time, but I'll try and avoid the really bad puns and jokes. And so let me read to you what he says. And I may have shared this with you recently, when in his beginning of his sefer called Das Shlomo, which are his shirim and essays on, in this volume, Purim and Pesach, in other words, the times of the Jewish year, he turns around and says the following important thing. The Jewish people have a job to do, and the job that they have to do applies in all the times and all of the ages. And of course, the challenges that each age offers up to the Jewish people are very remarkably different to other times. For example, if you lived in Frankfurt am Main and during the 19th century, as the Rothschilds did, in the ghetto, then at a time of rampant anti-Semitism, all the doors closed to Jews. Then, apart from if you call Rothschild and are perhaps the richest man in the world, then you are going to face different challenges. Confined to the ghetto meant that the Jews living in that ghetto had a 20 years, I should say. They had a 20-year shorter lifespan than people living outside the crowded ghetto walls, with, of course, the clear availability of disease to spread very quickly, which it might not do at the same rate outside. So that would be a challenge. Child mortality, these sorts of ideas. It would have been alleviated by the time the first decade of the 20th century, where Germany was not so anti-Semitic. It would be very different to living there now. Each time throws up its own challenges. But listen to what he says here. I'm going to establish how I understood the Torah's view of time before I opened Reb Yerucham's Sefer. I was speaking last week in Yerushalayim, in fact, 3 days ago in Yerushalayim, to the yeshiva Medrash Shmuel. I think it's my favorite place to teach in the whole world. A wonderful yeshiva under the leadership of a superbly unique individual, Reb Yerucham of Kelm. So I've been very, very proud to call a friend and known for a very long time. And the ruach there, the atmosphere is out of this world. I'm trying to get hold of the video, and I will put it on both here if you're watching it in my YouTube channel and also in Torah Anytime. So it'll give you a feel of it's the shir I said here incidentally last week. Although when you say it to a live audience, it becomes a very different shir with different bits added in. So I think it's certainly worthwhile watching as soon as I get it to you. But anyway, back to this. When I was saying that shir, it was based on, as I said, Reb Yerucham in Das Chochel Musar, Volume 2. This is the subsequent lecture when he talks about time. But let's start at the beginning. There's a wonderful statement here, an exciting statement from Rav Shlomo Volva about time. And he says the following thing. When it comes to the period in time which the Jewish people suffered one of the greatest catastrophes, which was the Shabtai Tzvi time in that century, when he sprung up and declared, or was declared, the Messiah, there was an astonishing, as you know, reaction from the Jewish people. Basically, he was believed, not obviously universally, exclusively, but hundreds of thousands of Jews were convinced that he was the Mashiach. And he quotes here that apart from the story itself, which was remarkable, he quotes here, there was a lady called Glickel, who lived in Hamelin in Germany, a religious Jewish lady who kept a chronicle of the events. And it's very well respected by rabbinic sources. And she says, Ketzad Yehudi, she writes, how many Yehudi Ashkenaz, the Jews of Ashkenaz, of Germany, the Shema Bias Mashiach, when they heard that the Mashiach had arrived, Mochro Bateim Mechsila, as came Chanorgel Noharu, Laham, Kedei Leyaz Krovim Lanomam, Manasa Eretz Yisrael. They sold their houses. They relocated to Hamburg. Hamburg, of course, is the port city, the great port city of Germany, ready to hop on the first available ship to get to Eretz Yisrael as soon as the trumpets are sounded and the declaration of the Mashiach's arrival has been, as it were, formalized. I heard that Reb Chaim Kanievsky, Zechat Tzadik Kodesh Livrocha, the God Ladar, who just passed away not too long ago, up until his very last days, if somebody came to see him from America or from England, he would say to them at the end of the conversation, don't go back. Do not go back. Stay here. The Mashiach's here anytime. Stay here and don't go back to America or to England. I've heard many people say that he told that to them, but I've never come across anybody who actually did. I'm sure there must have been, but it was few in number. Well, when the false Mashiach, Shazasi, arrives, according to Gluckel of Hamelin, then tens of thousands of Jews sold their possessions, sold their houses, ready to go. So says Rav Shlomo Volva. The story itself is well known, tragic consequences. Something you should focus on, however, is the incredible, pregnant anticipation that the Jewish people have always had for the coming of the Mashiach was expressed and demonstrated there in a most dramatic way. I mean, these people sold their houses, so convinced that the Mashiach had come. They just wanted the moment of freedom, of Cheres, to arrive, just like this week's Parsha, when the Jewish people go out from Mitzrayim. This is the moment, and carpe diem, they want to grab the moment and they want to be in Eretz Yisrael. Now, he says something which is tremendously interesting, and that is to say that times like that, there is expressed into the world a ruach, Zeitgeist is the German phrase, which would be freely available for people to grab hold of and turn into something positive. Now, in order to fully express what I'm trying to say, I'm going to turn to Rabbi Dessler, of course, another Talmud of Kelm, and the Chelik base of Michtam Eliyahu, page 21. He quotes the famous Rabbi Haratzi Hirschbroida. If I remember correctly, I may be wrong, Haratzi Hirschbroida was the son-in-law of the Alter of Kelm, I think so. Anyway, he says the following thing. Ki lo hazman over al-adam. It's not that time passes over a man. Ela ha'adam naseh b'tzarchat man. Rather, man passes through the times. Through the times. What does that mean? If you look in a history book, remember, go back to school, then you have the famous and well-known illustrations, visual illustrations you always find there of how history works. And it's a horizontal line, it's called a timeline. So you see the horizontal line with vertical sort of like marks going through the horizontal with a date at the top of it. 1066, if you're British, that will relate to that, was the conquest of England by the Normans coming over from Normandy, and then setting up an entire whole new monarchy, whole system. That's really the beginning of England from 1066 as we know it. And I suppose from an American point of view, that is, even though I don't think any American would recognize it, but that's obviously clearly, as America was based on England, that would clearly be a significant date as well. Go forward 30 years, you come to 1096. 1096 might be a more familiar date to Jewish people. It was the date of the First Crusade, when Christians took the cross, as it was called, hence the name Crusade, to go off to the Holy Land to destroy the non-believers, obviously in Christianity, that put into their minds, well, why travel all that way? Or why not get a bit of practice in by slaughtering all the non-believers who are not as far away as the Holy Land, but you can find them in the Rhineland, and you can find them in France, etc. Kill them. And indeed, hundreds of thousands of Jews were slaughtered in 1096. That's when Rashi lived. And many fled to Worms, where Rashi was situated, hoping to be protected somehow by his presence. And indeed, nobody was killed in the Crusades in Worms. Anyway, so basically, we have another incision there, slash across the horizontal line for 1096. Go to 1776, or is it 1777? I should know this. The American Declaration of Independence. And again, that's also the Revolutionary War. Another slash. Then I'll go really fast forward in time. In 1914, First World War. 1918, end of First World War. 1933, Hitler, Yamashima Shema, rises to power, becomes the Chancellor of Germany, and a step away from being the dictator of Germany. 1939, 6 years later, only 6 years, Germany opens the Second World War. And in 1945, it ends. 1948, there's the creation of the State of Israel. 1955. I pause, and I'm sure you immediately know this is certainly one of the most significant dates in Jewish history. I was born. And then if you add 120 to 1955, that'll be another incision, because that's the end of my life. 120 years is about the maximum you could hope for. And then time marches on. It's not said, we were saying before, it's not that time passes over a man, which in that example, it looks as though time is passing over a man, and he stopped and it carries on, but man passes through the times. What does that mean? So time is not, despite the history book's insistence of using the horizontal line, linear. It's not a line, it's a circle. Time's circular. And Rabbi Dessler on page 21 of Chelik Beis of Michtam Eliyahu that we just quoted from the Tzvi Hirschbroida gives the example of a spiral staircase. If your friend is going up the spiral staircase and you're watching him going, you're standing at the bottom in the same spot, you'll see him coming round again and again and again. He's moving forward, but he's coming round again and again. That's how time works. I suppose instead of being a line being circular, makes a lot of sense. After all, how does time evolve? How does time, how is it marked in our world, in our life? The answer is by a circle, by a rotation. The rotation of the planet around its axis, which takes obviously 24 hours, a teeny bit, that's a day. And then, of course, there's the rotation of the moon around the Earth, which gives us the lunar calendar. There is the rotation of the Earth and the Moon around the Sun, which gives us the solar calendar. And of course, all the planets are spinning around their axes in order to, and that marks time, that creates time. So I suppose the circularity of time would be obvious to anybody who considers the structure of our galaxy. Anyway, the important point is that means to say that when it comes to times, then it should be the case that when we come to the time of Pesach, when the Jewish people went out from Mitzrayim, then when you come around to that time again annually, just like the friend walking up the spiral staircase, you've come to the point of Zman Cherusenu. There is a release into the world, into the Avirah, into the atmosphere of freedom which is available both to Jews and non-Jews. It's a time of freedom. You can see that because, of course, as Rashi points out, the Jewish people's exodus was accompanied by lots of peoples from various nations who joined in. They wanted to exploit, they wanted to carpe diem, to grab this moment, and they too wanted freedom, and freedom from Egypt and its dominance, etc., and attached themselves to the Jewish people as a vehicle to give them that. So when there is an expression of something into the world at a specific time, it's fully available for everybody. Zman Matan Torah Senu, when it comes to Shavuot, 7 weeks after Pesach, then again, there's an expression of an energy, if you like, into the world. And that expression repeats itself in an annual cycle. Shabbos repeats itself in a weekly cycle. When you come around a smaller circle, every 7 days, then again, there's an expression into the world of a certain atmosphere. That certain atmosphere is Shabbos, Shabbat, an atmosphere of menucha, of rest, of simcha, of joy, of shalva, peace and contentment, all the things, and shalom, obviously, all the things that Shabbos brings to us. And that happens for the first person who experienced it, Odom Harishon, and it happens in the cycle for everyone. It was quite a tragedy for the first Christian monarch of the Roman Empire, Constantine. Emperor Constantine, when he convened in what is modern day Turkey, Nicaea, a whole convention of this new religion, and which he said he didn't like Jews. And he said, "Is there anything greater offense than this, that the Jews should tell us when our holy festival should take place?" Of course, because their Easter was calculated relative to, or part of, our Passover. So they have to wait for us to announce Passover because they have their festival. And of course, the changing of Shabbos to another day, to Sunday, perfectly okay, but he misses the point entirely. What Shabbos is a point in time, and it's on Saturday, not on Sunday. So there is this repeating process. Here, swapping back from Rabbi Dessler to Reb Yerucham of Kelm, he says that repeating process, there's an epoch that has run from the time of Shatzai to our time too. Freedom. Everybody wants freedom. Freedom from this, freedom from that, certain system of morality, certain system of economy. Now, when that atmosphere, when that ruach is released into the world, as I said, it can be taken up in positive directions, non-positive directions, negative directions by Jews and non-Jews alike. It's very intriguing to give an example, as the example he goes on to say, is when straight after the Shatzai movement had died, then we're moving a little bit forward in time. Then the time of the Vilna Gaon and the time of the Hasidic movement, there was, of course, a clash between the Vilna Gaon and his followers and the Hasidic movement. And yet, because that ruach, that freedom, was there, and says Reb Yerucham of Kelm, it was such an expression of this pent up longing to get out of this galus, of this exile, and to go back to Eretz Yisrael. It was taken up in a positive direction by the Talmidim of both the Baal Shem Tov, founder of the Hasidic movement, and the Vilna Gaon, the opponent of the Hasidic movement, and both sets of disciples of these two schools both moved to Eretz Yisrael, where they merged to form the old yeshiv. You can find them if you go to Miyat Sha'arim today, the Golden Kapotas and the Streimels. Streimels? Long payas? Talmudim Levil Nagon, who merged with Hasidim, that's taking it in a positive direction. And then you've got a negative direction. The negative direction is Herzl, a completely secular Jew who wanted a state for the Jewish people, which, as he wrote in his book Der Judenstaat, a very boring read, by the way, where he says very clearly that the ambition is to be just like everybody else, just to be another nation, no distinction whatsoever. And of course, the Torah's perspective is we're meant to be totally different to everybody else. We're meant to be a Nifkar, a priestly nation, not the same as everybody else. So, but here we've got that same atmosphere being led in the negative direction. And the freedom could be spiritual freedom, or it could be material freedom. And there's Jews who took it in the direction of socialism and communism and a million others. Well, that is wrong exaggeration, but many other isms as well. So there is a time, that's an epoch which has run from then till now. Because there comes a time in the world which something happens which you can turn into a positive or a negative. That's how I always understood time. And add a little bit more, again from Rosh Hashanah. This is in Chelik base of his most famous sefer, Ali Shur, in which he says the following thing. I'll read a little bit of this to you. The essay in page nun base is called Makaima Vizmanai Shel Adam, the place and the time of a person. Ha'adam ina yotzim mebayit. The person is not created in isolation. Rather, Makama Vizmanai Shachim Le'etzam Mahusai. His time and his place is totally formative in the person that he or she is going to become. Where you were born and when you were going to be born. I once had a column in Ahmadiyya, which I've been writing for most of my life, and in which I had the idea of to take the classic commentators in the Mikroas Gedolos Chumash, Rashi, the Ramban, the Porno, the Orach Chaim, Ibn Ezra, etc., and tell their story based on what he just said here, that a person's time and his place is essential to knowing who the person is. He writes and says, unless you know the person's time and the person's place, you won't understand the person. So that was the idea, to explain to people who Rashi was and what his time was. Ask anybody, where did Rashi live? And they'll almost definitely tell you France, which is completely wrong. There was no such country as France when Rashi in 1096 lived in what was known as the Rhineland. Ask people where the Ramban lived, and they will probably say Spain. Absolutely not. There was no country of Spain when the Ramban lived. It was a different country called Aragon, actually, with the capital of Barcelona, separate. There was no Spanish state. It was important to paint the picture. And he reads on, he writes on and continues, and he says, this idea is what it says in Pirkei Avos and Perek Daled and Mishnah Gimel. Ben Azai used to say, Al tehi boz l'kol adam, don't dismiss or disparage any person, Al tehi maflu l'kol dover, nor disparage anything, she'in l'chod adam she'in lo shah, ve'in l'chod dover she'in lo mokem. There is no person who doesn't have his time, and there's no there's no thing that doesn't have its place. They're called Nivrash Yesh Mokum, for everything that Hashem created, it's got a place. He mitzad gedula, he mitzad techlisei. Whether it's physical states like the Alps or the Sahara Desert, they're very much opposites of each other. It's got a place and it's got a purpose. And he quotes Rashi, who famously says, when the Meraglim were sent into Eretz Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu says, and see what the people are like. Do they live in fortified cities or do they live in unfortified cities? This would give you an idea of the fierceness of the opposition the Jewish people would be facing. If they live in fortified cities, like castles, it means they feel vulnerable. They have to build ramparts to protect themselves. If they live in unfortified cities, they're fierce warrior people, and they don't need the same protection. Because there are some places that produce different types of people. It's an interesting thing. Many, many years ago, when I just started being the campus rabbi for the 14 universities of the northwest of England, I think it was my first year, about the second, there was a Holocaust memorial event, and there was a couple, husband and wife, had both. They came from Lithuania originally. They both had come to tell their story. There was a massive turnout of Jewish students. The interesting thing was how diminutive, how small this couple were. Very small. I'm 6'1". They were literally up to just slightly less on my shoulder. But about 10 years after that, I think I gave my first lecture in South Africa, and I was speaking for Or Sameach. And then the Or Sameach show there, they have stenders, lecterns, for people who daven there, or little table stenders, so they can put the Sidurim and have it at a comfortable height to see the Siddur. And I'm 6'1", and I was literally one of the smallest people there. I was sort of like holding onto the stender that they gave me, because they are very tall, but they're all of Lithuanian descent. Lithuania, right up there in the north of Europe, cold, very dark in the winter, etc., produced very small people. The same people transported and transferred to South Africa, it produces big people. Same people. Same phenomenon, incidentally, after the Second World War. If I remember rightly, within 10 years, the height of the average Japanese had sprouted by about 2 or 3 inches beyond their parents. The reason was they were now eating, instead of the rice-based diet, their parents ate a wheat-based diet as a result of the Americans taking control of Japan. That became very common. Japanese people grew. Some places produce, and the food they produce produces bigger people, and some smaller people. Each place produces a certain sort of person. So the place that you live in and the time that you live is going to be critical to the person that you are. And unless we know who the person is, or his background, we won't fully understand the person. So time, again, is something. Obviously, people during the Middle Ages were very small compared to people today, but there's more than just smallness of stature. Various times produce different sort of human beings, the way they think. That can be intellectual, moral, or whatever. That's more or less how I understood time. And now I'm going to read to you from Reb Yerucham. Now, Reb Yerucham, the Sefer Das Chochmah Musar, this is Chelik Daled, and we'll be looking, for those who might have it at home and want to look inside for themselves, in Maimar Ayin Gimel, and that's the page Reish Kof Hey. Then he says something which is really quite astonishing. Now, I have to tell you that I learned this in, as I may have mentioned to you before, maybe last year, I can't remember, but I learned this with a grandson by marriage of Reb Yerucham. Reb Yerucham's family got out before the Holocaust and replanted themselves in New York, in an area of New York quite near a borough park called Bensonhurst, in the Beis HaTalmud yeshiva, which they set up. And I learned this sefer with my chavrusa, Rav Naftali Rakov, who incidentally is the son of my Rov, the Getzed Rov, Reb Tzala Rakov, every week. And no, he's a huge Talmud Chacham, and we've I'm roughly the same sort of age. We have both learned quite a bit. I certainly not put myself at anywhere near his stature, but we've learned enough for me to be able to tell you that we both consistently, week after week, come to the conclusion that ultimately we've learned nothing. Because Reb Yerucham's approach is utterly radical and utterly revolutionary. He sees things totally differently, to the extent, or he shows you things totally differently, things you thought you knew about, things you thought you were familiar with, and he shows you them in such a way that basically it screams from the page, why didn't you understand it like this before? And his conclusions are inescapable. He normally takes a medrash, quotes a medrash, and often it's a medrash that both my chavrusa and I are familiar with, and then he, as it were, says, you haven't really looked at this ever, have you? Look what it says, and constructs a whole new Torah, a whole new insight based on a clear reading of what the words actually say. Because who takes Midrashim literally or too seriously? He certainly does. And it starts to make sure that you do as well. So he starts off by quoting Koheles Rabbah. I think it's called Ecclesiastes in English, isn't it? Koheles, that's better, and it's in chapter Gimel. It's very difficult to know what of Koheles is the most famous bit. Either Hevel Havolim, we call Hevel, the very beginning, everything is nothing. But perhaps the fact that he says there's a time for everything under the heaven, a time to live, a time to die, a time to marry, a time to get divorced, a time to, etc., to go to war, to make peace. There's a time for everything. Well, that's well known. Listen to what the Medrash Rabbah has to say. The calls man, the A's, the called chayfetz man. Everything has a time. There was Zman Hoyle Adam Rishon Sheikonas Gan Eden. There was a time for Adam Rishon to enter Gan Eden. It says V'nichu began Eden. Hashem put him in Gan Eden. He brought him into Gan Eden. Zman Hoyle Loy Shegotzim Isham. And there was a time for him to leave Gan Eden. She garish as Adam. Zman Hoyle Avram showing his Lamino. Time for Hashem to give Avram the mitzvah of Mila. And a time for now, this is more than a time to live and a time to die. This is taking specific times in Jewish history, famous events. There was a time for those to occur. Now, this is a head-scratching piece of medrash, as he points out. And let me read to you what he says a little bit. The rabbis are teaching this. Yesod Mofil, an astonishing thing. Again, this is where he's saying to you, have you noticed this? Adam Rishon, who was made by Hashem himself, so perfect and such a sublime level above the angels, that as the Gemara says in Bava Metzia, the angels were not able to distinguish between him and Hashem. So far above them. There was a time when Hashem created him, it was appropriate to put him into Gan Eden. But there was a time for him to be kicked out as well. There was a time for him to be kicked out as well. Turning the page to Rish Kav Vav, Zman Hoyer Lo Shigas Bishal, a time for his expulsion. Shemot says the Yigorish Adam. He threw him out. Allah Hachetahu Hagarim Lo Bigash. Wasn't the thing he did wrong, the choice he made, the mistake in eating from the Eitz Hadas? That's what got him thrown out. I think there's a time for him to go. It was a choice. Is it a question of time that got him thrown out, or the consequences of his choices? I would have said, I understood. It's the consequence of his choices. Reb Yerucham says that's not what the Medrash says. The Medrash says it was the time that got him thrown out. Listen to this, absolutely astonishing. That's to say, wasn't that his choice that made him get thrown out? And had it not been for his sin, he would not have been thrown out from there. What's the Medrash saying? It depends on the time, a time to go. So this paragraph I will read to you from beginning to end, because it is absolutely critical and astonishing stuff. Well, there's another time he wants to discuss, and that is the time when the Torah was given to the Jewish people, 7 weeks after the Exodus that we're talking about in this week's Parshas BeShalach. And that only occurred 7 weeks later, after the Jewish people had worked very, very hard over 7 weeks to reverse the 210 years, the erosion of their Jewishness, which had occurred over 210 years in Egypt. Every day we echo this by the counting of the Omer between Pesach and Shavuos, where there is a whole structure which a person, a little booklet that goes through the various human character traits, midot, that you should be trying to work on that day to, as it were, replicate what they did in changing themselves from the slave nation to the free nation at Mount Sinai. Right. So it was that, having achieved that level, that could take them to Mount Sinai and for them to justifiably be given the Torah. Isn't it? No, he says. It's nothing to do with that. It was the time. At that time, there was going to be a Gilui Shechina, a revelation of God's presence in the world. And if they were up to it, that's fine. But it was going to happen anyway, whether they'd worked on themselves or not. Let me read to you again. So he says, the entirety of the Kabbalah Torah has Sigal Klal Yisrael, and this measure is saying it's nothing to do with all the work they put in changing themselves and becoming purged of what Mitzrayim had contaminated them with. It's time. Oh, but really, that Medrash Rabbah, take it seriously. It's telling us something big. Yeah, that's right. It was the time, not their choice, that got them the Torah. Time is not something which is superfluous or merely a support act to what's going on, merely a way of recording what's going on. Time is the cause of what's going on. So therefore he says, time is something which was woven into the fabric of the entirety of the universe the entirety of creation. And that is to say that Hakol, everything, Kolabriya Kula, everything in the world, Klalia Prati, whether in the big things, a period of time from Shabsai C till today, or small things, small periods of time. Hakol Talav Aymed Al Said Zeh Shosman, all depend on time. Zman Hoya was a time for Adam Marishan to enter Gan Eden and time from to leave. Zman Hoya Ena Kamosh on a Chosh, when it says there was a certain time that we are trying to think, no, when it says there's a time for this and a time for that, it's a time which is masugul. It is, as it were, good for you to get the Torah, good for you to get out from its round. Not at all. In Zman Tzarach, you got to understand that time, Shemasayid Hayetzira Shal Zman Atzma Kavar Yeshlo called over. From the moment that Hashem created time and the time thereof of the world, that everything that was going to come was already embedded within the time that Hashem created for this world. A kol kvar nigmar. It was all complete. It was just waiting to, almost like a flower ready to open, various flowers opening at various times for various things. Take an example. You'll find this incident, this idea in the third chapter of Shar B'Tochen in the Chavos Levavos, when he says that everything that Hashem wants to happen happens at a specific time. But that was programmed, as Reb Yerucham was saying, from the get-go, from the very, very start. So you could think of when I forgot his name, the person who discovered antibiotics, Scottish professor, I should remember this. Oh, my mind's gone blank. Well, it'll come to me in a second, I'm sure. So basically, the famous, still can't remember, this famous professor, when he came back from his vacation, he'd left a petri dish full of bacteria, and in had come some what's the word? I'm losing all my words today. In had come little fungi, and one of them had landed on the petri dish, and he noticed that they had not, that the bacteria had not been able to spread to that area. Then he put two and two together and said, well, maybe there's something in the fungus which is stopping the growth, inhibiting the growth of the bacteria. Antibiotics. Wow! He didn't know, incidentally, how to turn that into a medication. They had to go from Oxford University to Cambridge for a team of 3, including a Jew, German Jew who fled Hitler. They actually turned it into medicine. But it was he who got the famous award, the Nobel Prize, and not the 3 doctors who actually, the 3 scientists, turned it into medicine. I think it's a bit unfair, but never mind. A kol kavar nigma, you will say at that point, wow, if only they discovered that 10 years later, think of all the people's lives would have been saved. No, they wouldn't. Hashem did not want that to be part of time until it was part of time. Didn't want that thing to be seen, to come to the world, until it was time for it to come to the world. Oh, Alexander Fleming. I knew it would come to it. Professor Alexander Fleming, who was the discoverer of antibiotics. Anyway, that woven into the fabric of, a bit like a flower, ready to open, but already open through thousands of years. A plant with thousands of flowers opening at the right moment. Developments in time. And through that, those progression of events, that leads you inevitably towards these various completion steps towards the completion of the world. But in time, woven into the nature of time, is everything. Hasoid shall call avoidus adam hu sheyam mulchaven es atzmo liyas muchen lekabel es hashpa hayorad v'nishba alav m'seif hazman. Therefore, the purpose of a person, of a Jewish person, of a non-Jewish person, is to realize that when these great times come along, you've got to be ready for them. You've got to prepare yourself so that you can carpe diem, grab the day, grab the moment, and use it properly. And that, of course, during, giving an American example, during the Great Depression, the beginning of the 20th century, there was the idea of hobos, homeless people who travel from place to place trying to find itinerant workers, trying to find some work. And they often used to hop on trains, freight cars of trains that would take them from one place to the other, maybe they'll have better luck elsewhere. No, I've never done this, but I would imagine that you have to be extremely clever and extremely fit and get your timing just right to hop on a freight car. Otherwise, of course, you'd be mangled in the most horrible way and killed. Obviously, you're probably standing at a bend where the train slows down. And obviously, the same process if you want to get off before it stops, same idea. You'd have to know when to get off. Same here. You've got to know when to carpe diem, when to grab the moment. There are things that are going to be coming in time. Are you become the sort of person who's going to be able to grab that moment, exploit it for something positive? Or is it just there and you will sort of hitch onto its coattails and maybe it will be something negative instead? So the Jewish people, it's going to happen. There's going to be Yetzias Mitzrayim. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute because Yetzias Mitzrayim is a bit problematic. But there's going to be a Gila, a revelation of God at Mount Sinai. Whether they were ready on a spiritual level to be able to say Nasi ben Ishmael, that indeed is their choice. But time is going to determine that it's going to be happening then. And that's how they get the Torah. Okay, so let me read. It's an intriguing idea. I can't resist telling you this. You know, of course, that Moshe Rabbeinu is shown all of time. Adam Rishon was shown the whole of time, and Moshe Rabbeinu was shown the whole of time when he was on Mount Sinai. Famously, the Gemara, if I remember rightly, it's Menachos, the Gemara famously says, was it Kaf Base? I can't remember. Famously says that Moshe Rabbeinu was told by Hashem there's going to be somebody who will be able to discover Torah significance in the tagging, when the little spikes, little thorns they put on top of some Hebrew letters. And Moshe said, really? Can I see him? And he showed him. Of course, this was Rabbi Akiva, who Moshe Rabbeinu considered to be in a greater level than him, and said to Hashem, why are you giving the Torah to me when he was somebody like that? But he could see something that Rabbi Akiva could see, which is applicable, back to what we said before, in the Torah for his generation. Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't see it because it was in the Torah that he was given, but he couldn't see it applicable to his generation. It was only applicable to Rabbi Akiva's generation. But in this idea, you see that Moshe Rabbeinu was shown the Torah of Rabbi Akiva. And it showed all of the Torah. He was shown the Torah of Reb Yerucham of Kelm, the writing of the Shulchan Aruch, and he was shown the Torah of the Vilna Gaon, and he was shown, and the Chofetz Chaim. There's a famous medrash that says, had Esther, and Megillah Esther, had Esther not possessed the essential Jewish quality of saying something in the name of the author or the originator of the idea, and not stealing it for yourself. So you see this demonstrated when she brings the report, which she'd heard from Mordechai about the attempted assassination of the king to the king, and says, Mordechai told me this. And it turns out to be true, and the two would-be assassins are killed. Then, had she not done that, she would not have played the critical role that she did in saving the Jewish people. But then who would have saved the Jewish people? The Medrash says, Hashem's got plenty of Esthers. Hashem's got plenty of Esthers. Really? Yes. When Moshe Rabbeinu is shown Sefer Chofetz Chaim, the author of Sefer Chofetz Chaim was, well, a Chofetz Chaim, no? Yisrael Meir Kagan. But had Yisrael Meir Kagan not made himself into somebody who was worthy of authoring writing the Chofetz Chaim, then the person who would become named after that Sefer might have been Shmuel Barak Berenbaum or Yankel Yisrael Rabinovich. He would have been the Chofetz Chaim. There are plenty of Chofetz Chaims. Same as plenty of Esthers. Hashem's got no shortage of people who could do this. But have you become the person that you're the person, the one that's going to be able to do this? That's the question here. Okay. The work of a Jewish person is to prepare themselves to be able to, as it were, jump in that train at the right moment. As a man, to grab the moment at the right time. Because within that, the developments, whether in science or in Torah, it's all in the Torah. It's all in time. And time will evolve that process in its own good time. Are you ready? Is the question. Now, of course, there is a slight problem, and that is when it comes to Pesach, because suppose the Jewish people weren't ready. Hashem wants to take them out from Mitzrayim. Parshas BeShalach, we go out from Mitzrayim, and then we get ourselves ready to stand at Mount Sinai. But we're told that we went out from Mitzrayim in Parshas BeShalach. Had we been delayed there 1 second longer, there would have been no exodus available to us. We would have crossed the boundary between the 49th level of spiritual degradation to the 50th, at which point we would have been irrecoverable. Of course, 4/5 of the Jewish people saw themselves as irrecoverable enemy and wanted to stay in Mitzrayim under any circumstances. But therefore, surely it had to be an inevitability. And if just there is Hashem standing at Mount Sinai and creating this great revelation and nobody is there to take it up, then the world reverts, as we famously have in Jewish teachings, to tohu vavohu. There would be no world. So it has to be the Jewish people are going to be there. What do you mean it's dependent on Hashem makes the time there, the train is coming? If there's no Jewish people to jump on board, if we've not made ourselves ready, then there will be no time. It just won't work. And the world will go back to tohu vavohu. So this is where I deviate from the Litvische world and the world of Kelm to the Hasidische world. And at this point, I'll probably not be allowed back into Medrash Shmuel, but one of the into BeShalach Talmud, Reb Yerucham's children's yeshiva in Bensonhurst. However, I have to tell you that the sefer I'm going to quote to you is called the Shem Shmuel, one of my favorite Hasidic Sforim, well regarded in the yeshiva world, by the way. And I have to tell you another strange thing as well. I find very often that what Reb Yerucham says in Das Chochmah Musa, I want from his philosophical point of view, although it's lots of Kabbalah there as well, even though he doesn't express it explicitly, is very, very complemented by the perspectives of the Shem Shmuel and his sefer, and vice versa. They almost harmonize. And he says an astonishing, interesting thing. It's a question. So I'll read to you what the question says. We all know, Elo, right, beginning of the Haggadah, if Hashem had not taken us out from Mitzrayim, then none of us would have got out from Mitzrayim, and we would have been stuck there forever, lost our identities as Jews, and that would be the end of Klal Yisrael. So here's what the Shem Shmuel says. So he says, "V'lo hoitze HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael Misham with Hashem and the Tzara from Mitzrayim Haronu v'Avnenu v'Avnenu Mishabodem Hayinu LePara Mitzrayim." We would have been mishubed, we would have been enslaved to Para in Mitzrayim. Hikshu HaRishayim. All the Rishonim with the early authorities asked the question: how can he say such a thing? Hari HaKadosh Baruch Hu Nishba LaAvram Avinu v'Bris Ben Mitzrayim. Hashem had promised to give this to Avram Avinu in Bris Ben Mitzrayim. It had to be. There was going to be such a thing. And so this is what the Shem Shmuel says. But if we hadn't taken us out from Egypt, there would have been no Kabbalah Torah. There would have been no Mamat Har Sinai. The world will get back to Tohu Vavohu. Therefore, it had to be. So what do you mean time is just going to be there? And if we're not ready, then there would have been no time after that. So the Shem Shmuel says something tremendously interesting. Right at the beginning of Bereshit, when it says that the world was created, and before the world was created, Bereshit bara came to Oris Hoisa Tohu Vavohu, and the world was Tohu Vavohu. We normally translate, we normally think about that as being the world was nothing. There was nothing. Says Shem Shmuel, it's wrong. The world was Tohu Vavohu. The world existed, but in a state which we call Tohu Vavohu. That's not to say it was nothingness, but a state without the Jewish people. And a world without the Jewish people can exist That's what Nimrod's whole plan of making the Tower of Babel was all about. To replace the Jewish people with another people, him and his people, the unity between them would guarantee that they would be able to make an anti-Jerusalem, a tower going to heaven to mimic Migdal David, instead of a holy city on the top of a mountain, Jerusalem, a city in a valley, a negative opposite, a negative doppelganger of Judaism and of the Jewish people. Imagine a world, and some books write about this. Somebody told me there was a film or a TV series about this, which imagine what would happen to the world if the Nazis had won. The world could exist without the Jewish people. What he means is that had we failed to be able to get on that train, when that moment, that carpe diem, that moment in time arrived, when there was up the moment where Hashem was opening it out to the world, the possibility of the Torah being accepted by a people, had we not made ourselves ready to be that people, we would have missed the train. And the world would have gone to, it would have existed, but an incredibly evil place, a world without the Jewish people. So there are moments of time that come along. Everything's already programmed in time. The whole of history is already programmed. But what role, what part are you going to take in these historic events that happen, that are happening at this very moment in time? A positive one or a negative one? Are you going to get the energy that flows at a particular time to carry you along with it in a positive direction? Or are you going to use it to go in a negative direction? Communism, socialism, etc. As opposed to going back to Eretz Yisrael. That's your choice. And of course, the conclusion of this year is really goes without saying, get ready. We have to get ourselves ready for the circumstances that inevitably come along, the positive and the negative. Certainly the positive, that when the trains are coming, you're going to be able to jump on and get to the end of the line. I wish you all a wonderful Shabbos.